And dear listeners, in this part we consider similarities and differences between two great nations, China and India. And let's start what Goldman Sachs is telling us. Goldman Sachs International Investment Bank is forecasting that by the year 2050, the world's three top economic powers will be China, India, and the United States. Although the usual sequence is China and India, there are also those who are still putting their bets on India in the long term. Some of the reasons for preoccupation with these two powers will become very clear when we look at the sum of the facts of 2019. As we see, both countries have vast and comparable human resources, and the population of China is 1.39 billion, and that of India is 135 billion. However, despite of comparable population, World Bank reports that of 2019, nominal GDP of China was 14.3 trillion United States dollars, which is almost 5 times higher than that of India. Among Asian countries, China and India together contribute more than half of Asia's GDP, and China's economy has been growing by around 9% annually over the past decade. And in the same period, in contrast, India's economy is growing by only 7%. It is also interesting that in 1987, the nominal GDP of both countries was almost equal. However, China has shown since that time great economic progress, and now several times ahead of India in terms of nominal GDP. And let's now look at GDP per capita in China and India. And per capita rank of China and India is 72th and 145th in nominal terms. Consequently, per capita rank of China and India is 75th and 126th in purchasing power terms. And in my opinion, low population income is one of the important factors of India's underperformance in comparison to China. When compared to other developed countries, the proportion of agriculture and industry in China's GDP are significantly higher. Even though agriculture is also a major industry in the United States, it had only accounted for about 1% of the economy in 2017, while the service sector contributed to more than 70% of the economy in the most developed countries. Its share was considerably lower in China. This was not only due to China's low development level, but also to the country's focus on manufacturing and export. Share of export in GDP in 2019 was around 18%. However, as the future limitation of this growth model become more and more transparent, China is shifting its economic focus to the high-tech and service sectors. Accordingly, growth rate of the service sectors has been considerably higher than in industry and agriculture in recent years. We also see the increasing domestic consumption as share of export in GDP reduced from 26% in 2010. Let's look at India's GDP structure. In India, we see the different picture. India is perhaps better known not as a manufacturing, but as an entrepreneurial economy. In Indian economy, services are about 50%, a slight and steady increase over the last 10 years. Among the leading service industries in the country are telecommunications, IT, and software. And the IT industry is a vital part of India's economy. And between 2016 and 2017, IT generated about 8% of India's GDP alone. This is a slight decrease from previous years, when it made up about 10% of the country's economy. Nevertheless, the IT industry is growing, as evident by the quickly increasing revenue and employment figures. And IT here includes software development, consulting, software management, online services, and business process management, or BPM. This chart shows that the volume of high-tech goods in China export structure is also significant. However, these official statistics may be quite misleading. This is because it may consist of assembled high-tech products made from imported key parts and components, although the full value of the export is counted as a China high-tech export. One well-cited example is that of iPhone. In 2009, China exported iPhones worth of 4.6 billion United States dollars, although it was estimated that only around 4% was the value added by Chinese workers. A similar figure has also been given for the value added in SPC exports. However, now these figures are changing, given the Chinese companies more and more exporting their own developed high-tech goods. And let's consider the China's export partners. China's major export partners are European Union, United States, and the neighboring Asian countries. And the biggest categories of United States imports from China were computers, cell phones, apparel, toys, and sporting goods. And it's not a secret that the United States continues to worry about its trade imbalance with China. And the United States trade deficit with China in 2019 was around 350 billion United States dollars, or about 40% of the total United States trade deficit. That's 18% less than in 2018's 418 United States billion deficit. This explains the United States' pressure on China to revalue its currency. Additionally, US imposing tariffs and restrictions on Chinese goods. And because of its export focus, China is gradually becoming the richest nation of the world. And China's foreign exchange reserves stood at around 3.9 trillion United States dollars at the end of 2020. And because of manufacturing nature of China economy, the country is a huge importer of raw materials. China is representing more than 20% of the global demand for oil and more than 25% of the global demand for copper, aluminium, tin and zinc. The good import trade value in 2018 exceeded 2 trillion United States dollars. This accounted for nearly 14% of the global imports, making China the second largest importing nation worldwide after the United States. And China is also importing large quantities of components, in particular from Asia. Let's consider India's export structure now. India can be considered as a service economy. That is why the majority of its export are services. Unlike China, it's only 16th largest export economy in the world. And because of its economic structure, India had negative trade balance of around 190 billion United States dollars in 2019. And unlike China, significant part of India's merchandise export are commodities. India's main export partners are the United Arab Emirates, the United States, and China. The country leading exports including textile goods, engineering goods, and software, and also petroleum products. As for import, India mainly imports crude oil, chemicals, and machinery. And the import came again from China, the United States, and the United Arab Emirates, among the other nations. China and India in institutional strength. The assessment of institutional strength is mixed around these countries, because India is a long-standing democracy, and in contrast, China is ruled under the exclusive political leadership of the Communist Party of China. And as a result, China got lower scores in voice and accountability by World Bank. India also scores higher than China in such metrics as control of corruption, rule of law, and regulatory quality. However, China outperforms India by governance effectiveness and political stability. This may give China better chances to sustain high economic growth in the future. It is often an open question if being a democracy is necessarily an advantage in economic development. However, the experience of other countries suggests that the lack of democracy, free expansion, and open voice may in many cases act as a brake of economic growth. And it's actually the big break can be a big break for China. And the main disadvantage of China and India used to be the low income of population, and this constrains the internal consumptions. Both China and India are very poor in world terms, and the growing prosperity of the middle classes contrasts with the poverty in some population groups. In China, for example, 40% of people live in rural areas, and in India, the figure is even more higher, it's about 65%. Let's consider how the situation has changed by 2019. And according to the World Bank as of 2019, India still had 560 million people, or around 41% of its population, living below the poverty line of $3.2 per day. In contrast, China had only 40 million people, or around 2.9%, who live below the poverty line. So actually, China has seen a greatest drop in the poverty rates. The goal of China governance is to eradicate poverty as much as possible. However, millions of rural residents in China continue to struggle with low standards of living. And even in cities, migrant workers may sometimes face unsafe working conditions and are excluded from the accessing some critical social safety net protections. Let's consider macro weaknesses of India, and the main macroeconomic challenges which India may face is that the economic growth rates can be materially lower than in the past. If you remember, in the past, India grows for around 7%. And this is due to persistent, weak private sector investments and tepid job creation and inefficiencies in the financial system. And in turn, a prolonged period of slower growth may dampen the pace of improvements in living standards that would help to support sustained high investment growth and consumption. India has substantial debt burden of around 84% of their GDP in 2020. India's high debt is a product of persistent general government fiscal deficit, and low incomes add to the government's social and development spending requirements. And lastly, India's large low-income population limits the government's tax revenue base. All these factors may cause stresses in the economy and India's financial system. Let's now consider macro constraints of China. Unlike India, China has less economic challenges. This is underpinned by country's number of strengths, including the large size and robust average growth rate of its economy, which denote high shock absorption capacity, and large domestic saving foster high debt affordability through low financial cost. However, the authorities' multiple policy goals, sustaining strong growth, constraining leverage, reducing financial sector risk, improving capital allocation, have become more difficult now to achieve. In the short term, the growth will be negatively affected by COVID-19 outbreak in 2020. Weak external demand stemming from the broader and more sustained impact of the virus is also potentially a drag on China's short-term growth. Slowing external demand could also hasten supply chain shifts away from China, and such shifts will already happen before the outbreak. The new post-COVID shifts may potentially reshape the sectoral changes of Chinese industry over the long term. And long-term potential growth in the country can be at risk given China's deteriorating demographics and uncertain prospects for improved productivity growth. As China population gets older, in common with a number of other economies, the size of labor force will decline over the coming decades. This is China's disadvantage in comparison to India, for example, which has a younger population. And the United Nations estimated in 2020 the following. So the China working age population can decline by around 1% and 2% over the next 5 and 10 years respectively. This is very negatively compared with the 0.1% over the last 5 years. And the associated decline in labor inputs into the economy will deduct around 0.2% points from potential growth each year over the next 5 years. In addition, China's productivity growth performance has been weak over the past decade. And according to the International Monetary Fund, the country's total factor productivity growth since the global financial crisis is about half its average of 4.3% growth in the decade before the crisis. And the total factor productivity growth is estimated by subtracting growth in labor and capital inputs from growth in output. And the fall in China productivity growth has been driven by the falling infrastructure investments returns, as well as the shifting resources from the industrial to service sectors, as we discussed before. And industrial sector productivity tend to be higher than that achieved in the services sectors. This in turn reduces the economy-wide productivity growth. Improving total factor productivity growth depends on China's ability to improve its skills base, to improve their global-based technology and innovation, the management and operational techniques, and the quality of inputs. And China is investing significantly in innovation, and the key policy goal is to shift its economy towards the higher productivity sectors. And the key policy initiatives aim to move domestic manufacturing up to the value chain and make the China products, including electric vehicles, integrating circuits, information technology, aerospace, artificial intelligence, and biotechnology more competitive in the global and domestic markets. And the reforms are focused on enhancing the operational climate for the private-owned enterprise sector. The focus is on the following industries: transport and higher value manufacturing. And the reform are considering the liberalization of Chinese telecommunication and power generation sectors. Eroding global trading relationship is a significant downside risk for productivity growth of China. And China's desire to acquire and develop cutting-edge technology will likely remain a key source of friction with its key trading partners, including the United States and the European Union. This is because China's objective is to move further up the value chain and strengthen its national security position. Environmental, social, and governance considerations also pose a significant challenge to China authorities, and the cost of remediation of air, soil, and water pollution could add substantially to fiscal expenditures. Social considerations are significant in terms of their impact on the macroeconomic metrics, given the authority focus on maintaining social stability through economics and employment growth. And in addition, there are some governance issues with regards of efficiency of the state-owned enterprises and effectiveness of the Chinese government by itself. In this part, we consider strengths and weaknesses of China and India macro and financial profiles. In the next part of this lecture, we will compare and contrast the banking system of China and India. Be with you very shortly.